So I'd now like to introduce Matt Playford. I'm just going to now make Matt a presenter. Just stop sharing, and so he can share his screen. I'll just do that, and then I will introduce Matt. Okay, so I'd like to introduce Matt, who is a leading livestock veterinarian and the managing director of Dawbuts Animal Health, a company that operates a parasitology laboratory that conducts research on behalf of the livestock industry. Matt has a special interest in livestock parasite diagnostics and anthelmintic resistance. Matt will this evening cover the impact of worm burdens and the impact that they have on the health, welfare and productivity of beef herds, as well as some of the recent advances in diagnostic methods that are available to farmers that have made testing more accurate, faster and cheaper. Thank you, Matt, for making yourself available to speak to us about the latest on parasite developments in cattle. I'll now make you the presenter, which I have done, and hand over to you. Thank you, Matt.
Right. Thanks very much, Kathy, and I have to say thank you to Kathy for all the work organising this event. Also to Darren Hickey, the Vic DPI Better Beef Program, and Meat and Livestock Australia. Now, there's quite a lot of stuff to get through in the cattle worm control update because there's a lot happening in this space, and it all revolves around this issue: the best products for cattle in the world. Now, if you're wondering what these are, let's go and take a look. First of all, we have to go to Japan, and you'll probably recognise these Wagyu cows that are kept indoors. But also in Japan, there was a researcher named Satoshi Omura, and in the 1970s, he used to go around and carry little collection devices wherever he went, and he picked up some dirt from the side of a river when he was visiting his daughter down in Osaka, brought it back to his lab, and using the techniques described in this book, he grew up a particular bacteria called Streptomyces avomatilis, and from that, his colleague William C. Campbell from Merck derived ivermectin and several other of the avomectin family of anthelmintic compounds. Now, these are the best products for cattle in the world ever, and if we get anything that's even slightly as good, I'll be very happy. Because of their efforts, in 2015, they were awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine. Now, the products that they discovered was good that we could put them on cattle. It didn't really matter what we did. We could splash them on their back, we could inject them, we could put it down their throat, and they worked. They killed internal parasites, they killed external parasites. The cattle got fat and sleek, and pretty much all of our problems were solved. But that's no longer the case because we're starting to get resistance developing to these products. And to ensure that we can continue to use the best products in the world for many years to come, we actually have to now put the measures into place. So let's work our way through today's parasitic agenda. First of all, the types of cattle and the Coperia Species Project. New research, monitoring for worms, drench resistance, including how to diagnose it using simple and rigorous tests, and the treatments, choosing the right drench for timing, activity, and the economics of treatments. So we're starting off with the types and impact of worms. And when we look through some of the classic textbooks, such as this one's one of my favourites, Hungerford's Diseases of Livestock, you can see that they talk a bit about Coperia in the context of the 1980s and 1990s. And you can note that they say modern anthelmintics are very effective. Well, back in those days, they didn't have the MLs, the mectin class, and they had very, very high worm egg counts from fatal cases. There's another classic textbook written by Malcolm Smeal called Parasites of Cattle. And again, it talks a lot about Cuperia, but it makes the statement that Cuperia oncophora, which is one of the more common species of Cuperia, is not considered to be pathogenic, and animals develop a strong immunity to reinfection at 1 year of age. So we probably need to examine some of these 1990s references and find out if they're still current today. So the first major reference is this paper that was written by Lee Taylor and Andrew Hodge, looking at a big database that was collected from Zoetis. And what they did was analyse the database from about 60,000 cattle samples, and they found some of the major trends. And the first trend is the older the animals got, the less Cuperia they had. So Cuperia, small intestinal worm, definitely does develop, animals do develop immunity. But you can see the percentage goes from about 70% in young animals down to about 45 or 50% in older animals. It even seems to rebound a bit, maybe about 50%. So even though the immunity to Cuperia does develop as animals go past that 9 to 12 months of age level, they certainly don't shake it completely, and there's still a lot of Cuperia in these older animals. The second trend is for Osteotargia, the brown stomach worm, and that's the red line there, and we see that it increases, peaks in the group of animals that are about 2 to 3 years of age. And we think that the reason for that is that these animals are quite susceptible to the Osteotargias going into an inhibited stage and then breaking out again. And you can see decrease in older animals, but they really do peak in that 2 to 3 year age group. And that's very important because these parasites do a lot of damage. Hemonchus, we can see Hemonchus being Barber's pole worm continues to increase in percent in the worm egg count, the worm egg larvae differentiation of older cattle, but not a particular problem in Victoria. It's more a problem for up in New South Wales, Queensland and northern parts of Western Australia. Now, if we want to look at the types of worms recovered from larval cultures, we can look at this particular called worm tracks, and that shows us the worms isolated from cultures of cattle over about a 15-year period in southwest Victoria. And we can see that mauvey, maroni sort of colour is the small intestinal worm or Cuperia, makes up 72% of the isolates. And brown stomach worm, the other worm we talked about there, Osteotargia, is the one that does the inhibition. That actually accounts for about 18%. Now, if you're able to cut these animals open and have a look, which is not often done, but a very useful research technique, you'd find there's probably more than 18% Osteotargias there, but they don't lay a huge number of eggs. Now, the Cuperias don't lay a huge number of eggs either, not like Barber's pole worm, which are very, very prolific, laying thousands of eggs per day. They lay more than the Osteotargias. So this gives us a good snapshot of what's happening in different areas, but it doesn't reflect 100% what's happening inside the cattle. If we move to the other areas of Victoria, and this includes Tasmania, then we can see that there's still a lot of Cuperias here, a few Barber's pole worms, and still 18% Osteotargia. Now, the other worms that we see here, Trichostrongylus, stomach hair worm, and the nodule worm, aren't as pathogenic. They don't cause as much harm as Cuperia and Osteotargia, simply because they don't get up to the numbers or do the physical damage or affect appetite in the same way as those other worms do. Now, going back to the descriptive paper from Andrew Hodge and Lee Taylor, we can see that over the 10-year period that they analysed, there were hundreds of different cultures done. If we look just at the Cuperia, we can see that Cuperia started off in around 30% in 2002, 2003, from a very small number of cultures. And then as the cultures numbers went up, you can see that Cuperia percentage of the total number of worms increased. And this is seen as some sort of evidence that Cuperias have been increasing in numbers since the introduction of the MLs and since the Mectin class of drench became the main class that people use. So by 2012, the Mectins were definitely the most commonly used products in Australia, and Cuperia were correspondingly the most common worm found. And it's a well-known feature of Cuperia that they are very strong against MLs. They may not be resistant, but they're the first ones to survive MLs treatment, and they will survive a dose level, kill all of the other worms in the cattle. So to find out more about Cuperias, we've got a research trial going in all areas of Australia, and the idea is to get 300 different samples from cattle herds and find out where the different species of Cuperia are, because even though the records may only show Cuperia there, the different species of Cuperia are actually critically important. Now, Cuperia oncophora is very common in places like New Zealand and Europe, where it's reasonably cool, and it's always been thought to be the dominant worm in southern Australia, so through most of Victoria. And then the other two common species of Cuperia, pectinata and punctata, they actually cause more harm, as well as decreasing the average daily gain of cattle. They'll actually cause scours, poor doers, and even resulting in death. So you really do want to know where the pectinata and punctata species are occurring. And after doing about half of the larval cultures, we've already found it in places like Gippsland. Farm A sampled, in June, had 100% C oncophora, and Farm B, just down the road, postcode 2470, sampled in April, had 100% Cuperia, punctata, and pectinata. Now, we've done a couple of dozen of these larval cultures. We know that Cuperia, punctata, and pectinata are not uncommon at all in Victoria, Western Districts, Gippsland, and in central and northern Victoria. We find them in all areas. It could simply be a result of increased cattle trading and the fact that these worm species have been introduced from northern areas, or they may have been there all along and we just haven't diagnosed them. So moving on to Osteotargia, this is the fourth stomach, the abomasum, and you can see the lining is covered with these bumps. And this is not uncommon when you look at the abomasum of older cattle, particularly 2 years and above. When they're slaughtered, inside you see these bumps, and that's a result of scarring from the Osteotargia, the brown stomach worm, burrowing into the mucosa, into the lining of the stomach, and living there for a while. Now, this is part of their normal life. They do it in calves. They tend to reserve this behaviour for animals that are yearling age up to first calvers. And so they're the group of cattle that we have to be particularly careful of, because when they burrow in, they can reach numbers of several thousands or tens of thousands. And of course, when they decide to exit the mucosa, when the climatic conditions are more conducive to their offspring surviving, when they get a bit of a green tick and they can detect the choice green grass coming through the stomach, they'll all decide to leave and grow up into adult worms. When they do, of course, they damage the stomach lining, and the stomach lining of the other meson produces hydrochloric acid. It produces pepsin, a digestive enzyme, produces mucus, and of course that affects digestion of the food that comes through the stomach. So these animals do very poorly. A second effect of these animals deciding to exit, a lot of them at the same time, is that you get massive tissue damage, hemorrhage, and the animals will actually die from it. So this is a disease that I saw in northern Victoria and around Yea when I was a new graduate back in the 1980s, but it's been largely under control in the past 20, 30 years, thanks to these best products in the world that we've been using that are very effective against them. But this disease is re-emerging now. So let's keep an eye out to the target. It occurs especially in late summer and autumn, and you'll see yearling to 2-year-old cattle doing poorly, scouring. They'll have poor weight gain. It may even progress to death. Their appetite is usually okay, so this is a way of distinguishing it from standard Osteotargia disease or disease caused by other types of worms. There's a low worm count because there's few adults. Most of the worm burden is larvae, but if you culture the dung, you'll find Osteotargia in the culture. And the best way of diagnosing it is to take blood samples for plasma pepsinogen. So ask your vet to blood sample a couple of cattle and ask for plasma pepsinogen if you suspect this disease.
Excuse me, Matt. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I'm just wondering if you might like to turn off your camera, and that might just slightly improve the audio for everyone. It's not too bad, but a little bit scratchy, and I think if you turn that off, it'll just help your
Turn off the camera.
Just turn off your video, the little red one down the.
Yeah, I don't have any.
Okay, I think I can do it for you.
All right,
There we go.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that.
Okay, so in summary, section 1, Capiria is the most common worm in cattle, isolated from dung. Knowing the species is important, so if you don't know what type of Capiria, you can actually ask for that to be done at the lab. Osteotargia, brown stomach worm cases are increasing, and you can confirm the suspect type 2 Osteotargia with plasma pepsinogen test. It's a more specific diagnostic test that looks at the amount of pepsinogen from stomach damage that gets into the bloodstream. Let's look at some of the latest research in Australian beef cattle worm control. And the is a paper that was just published this year by people from the University of Sydney and Dawbuts. And they actually looked at using molecular techniques, polymerase chain reaction, to confirm the presence of Capiria pectinata and Capiria punctata. So it paves the way for easier diagnosis of these harmful types of Capiria. Now, for the second research paper that we're going to look at, we're going to travel to Queensland, and I know you think Queensland is the home of the yak and these big floppy-eared monsters, but they do have some very handy cattle up there. And this research was done by Melissa George and Matt George, as well as they're from Bovine Dynamics, and Andrew Cotsey from CSIRO in Brisbane. They looked at feedlot cattle, and you can see there's a few features of these cattle that we should look at. The first one is these feedlot cattle were sourced from various places in Queensland, and their average induction weight was about 404 kilograms. They were in the feedlot for 100 days, and some of them were treated with various products and others weren't treated at all. And you can see there is a difference in their exit weight. Even though their entry weight was about the same, their exit weight was quite different. In fact, it's 6.2 kilograms difference over 100 days. That between cattle that only had worm egg count of somewhere in the 70s at production. So they came to the feedlot, they've got a worm egg count of about 70 something, and some of them got treated, some of them didn't. Daily gain was quite different, and you can see their exit weight is 62 kilograms higher in the treated cattle. That's their live weight. So there's a indication there that a worm egg count of 72, which many in the past would have considered totally insignificant, is an important indicator of worms that need to be treated, that will actually give you an economic return. Most of the worms in this study were Cuperia and Hemonchus, which is Barber's pole worm. A few other for another table, but this is probably the best way to demonstrate these figures, and I know beef cattle producers are very good at sorting data. This divides the cattle, these are the untreated ones, divides cattle that came in and had a fecal egg count less than 100 or above 100. And the first thing we see is the cattle that had a fecal egg count under 100 and weren't treated had an average daily gain that was a bit higher, 6, compared to the cattle that were above 100 eggs per gram in induction. Okay, so we can see that there's a difference between cattle above and below 100 eggs per gram in induction. But how low does this effect go? Okay, well, here's another analysis of the same data that divides cattle into 3 groups. This is cattle that were both treated and untreated. Some had very low fecal egg counts, 25. Others had 25 to 50. And then the third group was over 50 eggs per gram. And these counts were done for 2 weeks. So even in cattle that had a treatment or cattle that were untreated, they've all gone into the same analysis. And a very interesting feature that comes out of this analysis is even cattle that had fecal egg count between 25 and 50 had an average daily gain impact. Their average daily gain was only 2.03 compared to the cattle with the lowest worm egg counts under 25, which is 1. And you can see there is a bit of a sliding scale indicated here. The cattle that had greater than 50 eggs per gram only had an average daily gain of 2. Pretty important clues that we can get from this particular study. We can apply that to our treatment of pasture-raised cattle right across Australia, including in Victoria. Now, another study that was done recently, this was only done in April 2020, and a very interesting study out of Charles Sturt University, thanks to Professor Bruce Allworth, who supplied this. But the work was actually done by Jane Nelson as part of her honours program thesis. And they 4 different farms, and they had varying numbers in treatment groups between 10 to 15, and also varying fecal egg counts at the start of the trial. And they tried an injectable product, ivermectin, a poron, ivermectin combined with levamisole, and an oral product, which was a triple. So we're looking a little bit across platforms here, but we can see that the combination products had 100 or close to 100% efficacy, and the ivermectin injectable had efficacy that ranged from 54% up to 97%. The thing that they did was they looked at different ways of counting the worm eggs, and so they've actually looked at mini FlowTac, which is the Italian worm egg count chamber, McMaster, which is the standard one used in most labs in Australia, FlowTac from a second location, and the FecTac G2, which is a based device. That means you don't have to look down the microscope, because it does the counting for you. All of those had pretty good agreement in diagnosing drench resistance. So to summarise, and this is a picture, I have to give credit to the hard-working team in the Dawbuts lab. That's Phil and Adriana there. Caparious species can be detected by microscopic methods and by polymerase chain reaction. Benefited from treatment, putting on an extra 6.2 kilograms live weight over 100 days, and there were several different treatments tried. They all had a very similar. The impact of worms on average daily gain in the feedlot detected down to 25 eggs per gram. Combination treatments work better than single actives, and different methods for worm egg counts were all able to diagnose drench resistance in beef cattle. Okay, well, let's move on to worms in cattle. So this is a picture from Northern Vic where the heifers are being put out on stubble, and it looks like they haven't got much to eat. And what they will eat is probably dictated by how much appetite they've got, and that can be impacted by worms. The ways that traditionally we've used to decide whether animals need treatment or not. So body condition score, very important for animals' performance. And we're generally measuring from 1, which is skinny, to 5, which is fat. We also look at the mucous membrane colour, and that becomes pale, particularly with blood-sucking worms such as Barber's pole worm or liver fluke. And in cases of liver fluke, it can even look yellow. The best place to look for a female herd, the mucous membrane colour, is by parting the lips of the vulva. But if you have male animals, then you can actually look in their eye, look at the colour of conjunctiva. Bottle jaw is a fluid swelling under the jaw, and again, it's very common to see that in bad cases of liver fluke or Barber's pole worm. Scouring, of course, where you'll see dags, not specific to worms, but is a consistent sign. Activity. Now, this is difficult to monitor unless you actually have activity trackers on animals. Animals with high worm burdens walk a lot less than animals that have low worm burdens. And you can probably also detect it in rumen fill and chewing time. Production is lowered with decreased lactation and average daily gain, and we also get coughing in response to lungworm infection. The bad thing about all of these indicators is that compared to weighing animals or using more objective measures, the damage is already done by the time you see them. So we want to get ahead of the game and predict when the worms are going to cause problems before the problems actually impact their production. We've lost a lot of money on them. And so if you take dung samples, and this is just a photo showing scooping up fresh dung from the middle of a cow pat and putting it into a container to send off to the lab so we can do worm egg count. If you're interested in taking samples or want to see best practice for taking dung samples, there is a YouTube clip. Just put in Dawbuts cattle parasitology, how to take dung samples, and that will direct you to the YouTube site. Now, once we have the dung samples, again, hard-working team, Andrew, he's looking for liver fluke eggs, and Phil on the other side, on the right-hand side, is looking at normal worm eggs, and he's using the mini Flowtac counters. Now, we use a lot of mini Flowtac now in cattle because generally they're more sensitive. In fact, we've got sensitivity down to 5 eggs per gram compared to the standard used in most labs, which is 50 eggs per gram. So we're 10 times more sensitive than the traditional worm egg count method. And so for cattle which have generally very high dung volume per day dung production, and the worm eggs are diluted a lot, they have worm egg counts, we can easily monitor their worm population. Drench testing can be completed without the prerequisite of 200 or 300 eggs per gram, which was previously required. Indication of how effective the mini flow pack is. So the top of this line here on the master, we've just got a long run of zeros. Most of the mini flow pack counts actually picked up worm eggs. The other method that's being used a lot more in recent years is the pack method. And this technique revolves around taking a photograph of the worm eggs at 5 different levels and then melding it all into a single image that can be uploaded to the cloud and read at the lab. And the idea is that the eggs accumulate around the meniscus of a collection device. You can see here the eggs floating to the top and collecting around the top of that device. And so when all the eggs are collected there, then they can be and also the different eggs are indicated. You can see there's a dot on every one of the eggs there. So this can count cattle worm eggs down to 20 eggs per gram, so it's a lot more sensitive than the previous methods used. And because it doesn't require special skills or knowledge about the shape or the behaviour of worm eggs, it can be done routinely by with people who don't have specialised training. There's projects going on now to identify fluke eggs, and pretty soon fluke will be added to the testing capabilities of VetPack. So these are already in a lot of stores, vet clinics around Australia, and they promise to actually bring cheaper and more available worm egg count testing for beef producers. Right across Australia, instead of just guessing when those cattle are going to be affected by worms, you can actually take worm egg counts and monitor them and get a pretty fair prediction of what's going on. Okay, so just to summarise, section 3, know the worm egg counts and the type of worms present before treatment, because your treatment will be guided by the worm egg count and the type of worms present. You can send samples to the lab. You can get samples analysed using PEC-PAC G2, or you can conduct microscopic examination in a vet clinic or other trained personnel. Now, other signs to check for include body condition score, scours, and bottle jaw, but they actually appear when the animals have already lost a lot of production. And by monitoring your growth rates, you can actually work out the cost benefit of treating cattle for worms. Right, let's move on to drench resistance. So we've got some cattle here in the paddock. We want to drench them, but we don't know what drench to use because some of the drenches have developed resistance. Let's have a bit of a look at what's going on. The first thing is there's always going to be a balance between resistance and productivity, and that's because the more we drench cattle, the more we select the worms for resistance. And after a few years of this, we have populations of worms with high levels of resistance genes in them. Now, modelling will show that resistance is inevitable because when you look at a worm like Monchus, the barber's pole worm, its genome is about as big as in people. They have males and females, they have sexual reproduction, and they have ample opportunity to create mutations and express those mutations in their offspring. And so there's always very small numbers of worms in the population that will have resistance to any drench. And when we select for them over time, the amount of resistance increases in the population. To test for resistance, there are different ways of doing it, and we've had some good guidance from some of the experts in the field, including our very own Phil Steen, who worked out that if you're going to be doing a fecal egg count reduction test, then you should be looking at 90 eggs. And that means you must use either a lot of cattle, have a very high worm egg count, or use sensitive method for detection. You have to actually look at 90 eggs to get a reasonable level of confidence that your estimate of efficacy is reflecting what's happening in the real world. The other thing is that before and after testing, just a way of testing, and probably biologically speaking superior to using an untreated control group. And that gives us a lot of confidence now to write a protocol for worm egg testing that looks like this. On day 0, you collect the dung samples and treat the cattle. And then 14 days later, collect the samples. Now, you don't have to actually go in with a glove. If you're using one type of drench, you can just pick up the samples off the ground. As long as they're fresh samples, watch that video on YouTube to work out the best way of collecting those samples. Now, the starting worm egg count, 200 eggs per gram is the traditional standard, but if your lab is using a more sensitive method, then you may be able to get away with half of that. And so the sensitivity of the worm count is critical for doing drench tests in cattle. I think we have to emphasise that reduction in worm eggs won't tell you about resistance. It'll only tell you about treatment failure. It's only when you do a larval culture of the dung and work out what worms were there and how much the reduction was in each worm species that you can actually tell if there's resistance or not. So in cattle, there hasn't been as much research done on drench resistance. There's been a few really benchmark studies conducted. In Victoria, there's been a few done in dairy cattle, in Tasmania as well. But in beef cattle, we're just using piecemeal information, but we've been able to put together a bit of a snapshot, a bit of a drench efficacy summary. And I'm sorry about the smiley faces and the frowny faces. We don't have figures on these efficacy estimates. And so that's the best we've got at the moment. So let's start off with Cuperia. We know from history that the MLs, the Mectin class, have difficulty in killing Cuperia. And so ML porons are struggling with Cuperia, and ML injectables are still doing very well in some places and starting to fall off in other places. Against Barber's pole worm, it's a bit more complex because there's a lot more variation. And again, the injectables perform the poron products. With Osteotargia, we've already had resistance detected in MLs in Victoria. But again, the injectables outperform the poron products. The thing that we use drenches for is for activity, and the levamisole products, BZ orals, and the oral triples, although they have very high efficacy against the Cuperia and Barber's pole worm, they miss out in persistence and in claims for type 2 Osteotargia. We can see a role there for particularly the triples and for using oral levamisole in combination with your favourite ML products, which I'll repeat, best products in the world. Okay, so summary of section 4. Before and after, that means day 0, day of treatment, and day 14, worm egg count and larval culture is a great way of testing the efficacy of your drench and seeing if there's resistance. But you have to work out what species of worm is surviving the drench, because at some times of the year you'll have a lot of one type and other times you'll have very little of it. Choose a drench that addresses the worm and use paddock management to avoid over-drenching. So you don't need to drench them all the time if you use clever environmental management. Okay, well, look, let's move on to treating cattle for worms, making those treatment decisions. So far we know that the cattle at the right age to get Cuperia, Osteotargia, which is brown stomach worm, also stomach hairworm, and some nodule worms. They also are at the age where they probably have peak worm burdens and peak susceptibility. You've done your worm counts, you've done your larval culture, you know a bit about these worms, but you don't know the right drench to use until you've done a drench resistance test. Then you're faced with the options. Now, oral treatments used to be very popular until the ML class came along. Then injectables and porons became even more popular. And for a while, we injected milworm, levamisole as well, but even that's not used that much anymore, although it is available still as a poron. These options, let's have a bit of a look at the detail. First of all, we've sort of been talking a lot today about the three different classes, and just in summary, we've got three different modes of action. So used in combination, you know, they definitely kill worms better. And the reasons why are so popular is because they kill external parasites. They've got extended duration of protection, and they are generally very safe. There's only two caveats there, and that is with ivermectin in young animals, and in cattle that means really under 100 kilograms, and moxidectin in skinny animals. Levamisole can have its own as well, especially young animals, but if you've ever used it in adult cattle and seen them walk down the paddock and jump over a fence, you'll know they actually cause a bit of excitability. The BZs are probably the safest group, but unfortunately they're not working as well currently against worms. But I tell you what, they still do have very good results in some areas, and so maybe worth a try. Only available, so you probably picked up that I'm trying to get you to consider using oral drenches, injectable drenches in favour of porons. Maybe an issue for safety. Say you've got a lot of big, strong cattle, don't have very good yards. You may think, well, it's not worth injuring myself or people who work on my place just to get better efficacy. And look, I'm not going to argue with you. The research that's been done, and this is a study that was done in New Zealand, 14 different farms, and they tested the amount of active ingredient that was available. Now, just because it's moxidectin, it's just that moxidectin was available for this trial, doesn't mean that this is unique to moxidectin. This is probably common across all of the mectin drenches. But if you look at the area under the curve, which really looks at the amount of active ingredient that gets into the tissues, or in this case, bloodstream, you can see that the injection has a lot higher level than the oral drench, which again is twice as high as the poron. And that happens despite the fact that the labeled dose for poron contains 2.5 times as much moxidectin as the injection. So we're using a lot more in a poron for a lot less effect. And we've got away with it for 30 years because these are the best products in the world. They'll work even though we abuse them. And let me assure you that using a poron is abusing the chemical. We can see that there's differences in efficacy as well in the oral versus injectable versus poron, mainly due to the fact that when you put a poron on animals, they do two things. They lick each other and lick the product off, and they lick themselves. And studies have shown that usually about 50% of the dose that animals are getting from a poron actually comes from licking. So if you think that you're treating only the skinny animals or the animals that need it, think again, because as soon as they go in the paddock, they're sharing it. And so on average, even though you might weigh each animal to the kilogram and adjust the dose you give them, when you use a poron, half the animals get underdosed and half get overdosed. And there's not a lot you can do about it because that's simple animal behaviour. That's led to the pour-ons now being less effective than the injectables and the oral treatment. In summary, if you have a choice, then whatever reason you've been using for continuing to use a pour-on, whether it's got a good crush or you don't have enough staff or you don't want to use a hook, go and buy that crush. I'll strongly encourage you to put in the facilities you need to use an injectable or an oral in favour of the pour-on product. It's going to make these products last longer, and you will have better effects as well. So, what do we have to look forward to? Do we have any new active ingredients? The last couple of active ingredients that were released for sheep one of them found their way into the cattle, and that's so it's available if you want to treat cattle with Dawbuts. I don't think many people are yet. I haven't seen any results coming through our lab yet anyway. So that's the one that's available already. But I'm not aware of any others that are making their way into the marketplace. New diagnostic methods, yes, there are. We talked about mini flowtac, which is more sensitive, and we talked about FetPack, which is both more convenient because you get same-day results and also more sensitive than the traditional methods. The other exciting news that I can share is that Parabos cattle, again sponsored by Meat and Livestock Australia, will be available around the end of this year. And it won't just be about internal parasites, there'll also be sections on lice, ticks, mites, and other external parasites. And the other thing is that the more research and knowledge, the better management and the better product selection we'll have for managing parasites in cattle. Okay, so I'll give you a summary, and these are the 6 main points. The first one is that Coperia and Ostotargia, Coperia, the small intestinal worm, and Ostotargia, the brown stomach worm, are the main internal parasites in southern Australia. They're both important, and the reason is because, as I mentioned before, the brown stomach worm causes a lot of irritation and damage, loss of function in the abomasum, which is critical for digestion, and so the animal's flow of digester into the intestine is affected. Coperia, on the other hand, affects the villi and causes the mucosal layer of the small intestine where absorption of food takes place. And so when they're working together, which happens pretty much all the time in southern Australia, you're actually getting a double whammy. So you're getting Coperia stopping absorption of food, Ostotargia stopping digestion of food. Now, the more dangerous species, C. pectinata and C. punctata, are found in Victoria, just as they are in Northern Australia. So they're probably more common in Northern Australia, but it's not unusual at all to find them in Victoria. And that includes Gippsland, Western Districts, Central and Northern Victoria. If you conduct worm egg counts, you can monitor the worm status, and the more sensitive tests you use in cattle, the better. And so some people now are doing tests where they're testing with a sensitivity of 2.5 eggs per gram. And that's because cattle have lower worm egg counts than sheep, and we really do need to recalibrate our expectations about what tests we use in cattle. The other thing about the worm egg counts is that we can use them to test the efficacy of drenches, and then choose our drenches based on how well they're working. We don't want to use drenches that aren't working properly. The first impact of that is that the cattle won't do well. The second, you'll contaminate the pastures. And the third is that you'll continue to select for high levels of resistance in those drenches. lastly, and I hope I'm not hammering the point, avoid use of pour-ons where you can get away with it. Use injectables instead. They will work better and your drenches will last longer. Okay, well, look, that ends my presentation, and I'm going to hand back to Kathy now, who has been collecting the questions, and hopefully we'll be able to have a bit of a forum now where we can share some information.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Matt, for a very detailed and comprehensive presentation. You've certainly covered a lot of information there. I'm sure we're going to have a few questions coming in. We have got a few already in the Q&A box. So for those of you that would like your questions answered, you can either enter them into the Q&A box, just type them in, and we can read them out and Matt can answer them. Or if you'd prefer to raise your hand, if you'd prefer to ask your question verbally, you can raise your hand and we can unmute you and you can ask the question. And as I mentioned earlier, what we might do is there's a few people that I think we've got about 7 or 8 that have called in by phone. We'll go through and unmute all of those microphones because obviously those people can't raise their hand. And
okay. Well, Kathy, we've got some questions up there on the Q&A page. Do you want me to start with them?
Yes. Would you like Darren to read them out, Matt, and then you answer them?
Good idea. Good idea, just in case.
Just so that everyone can hear the question. So would you like to do that, Darren?
Yep, no worries. You can hear me okay?
Yep, no problem.
Great. G'day, good evening, everyone. And thanks again, Matt. Great presentation. So we've got a few questions coming in the Q&A panel there. I did notice before I go into those questions, I did notice there was someone by the name of Andrew Gaunt had his hand raised fairly early on. Just wondering if we could unmute Andrew, Kathy, and see if Andrew had a question or not.
Okay, Andrew's now unmuted if you wanted to ask something. Andrew may have inadvertently put his hand up without realising, perhaps.
It's quite possible. That's fine. Okay. All right. We'll just get straight into these questions then. So I'll just read them out in order that they came in. The first one is from Katie Davis, and the question is regarding drenching and pour-on sharing. How long does this last in days?
Well, look, Katie, that's a very good question. Fortunately, the research has been done. The effect lasts for 10 days. Now, it won't be as high at 10 days as it is at 1 day. In fact, the first couple of days probably accounts for the bulk of the sharing of the drench, but it will occur all the way up to 10 days. Now, that's critically important if you're doing a drench because you can't actually, drench different animals with different types of pour-on and put them in the same paddock together. And so if you're doing a drench, use an oral or injectable. If you want to test a pour-on drench, just do it with the one group of animals.
Very good. Thanks, Matt. Moving on to the next question from Ron Sawyer. Most of these chemicals kill dung beetles. Do you have advice on minimising the adverse impact on dung beetles?
Yes, there's been a lot of research done on this as well, Ron. And the good news is, the summary is that MLs, which are the ones that most people use, probably 3/4 of the doses given to cattle in Australia are MLs or mectins. They will kill dung beetles if you actually give it to them, but the disposition of the chemical in the dung is that it's attached to the fibre, and adult dung beetles, as you may know, suck the juice out of the dung. They don't actually eat the fibre. Park it away in the ground, and they lay their eggs in it. When the larval beetles hatch out, they will then eat the fibre and possibly pick up chemical. But it's been found that most of the impact using mLs is gone by that time, and so the overall impact on the populations of dung beetles is minimal. So beetles and treat cattle at the same time. There are other chemicals we might use for lice or for fly protection that do have a bigger impact on dung beetles, so be careful how you select them.
Okay, thanks for that question. Next question is from Urion Thomas. Do you think the long-acting mode of ivermectins, especially MOX, contributes to resistance development?
Yeah, thanks for that one, Aaron. You've really set me up here, mate. I'll remember this. This is actually one of the most vexing questions in Australia, and it's something that we've probably spent a lot of time on in cattle, but the answer really lies in sheep. And so we've found that mLs with a very short pharmacokinetic profile, such as ivermectin, have less selection for resistance than ivermectin, which is a bit medium, sort of in the middle. And moxidectin has each way, and by that I mean that it has high potency, and so it has a good head kill, and yet it has a longer tail because it's absorbed into the fat and released very slowly. In fact, it's 100 times more lipophilic than ivermectin, and therefore it persists in the body for longer and is able to be exposed to worms for longer. So, you know, we don't really want to take sides too much on this one. There are pros and cons for the different products.
Very good. Next question is from Lyndall Dean. At what worm egg count would you recommend to drench for young animals and older animals, or does this depend on the sensitivity of the test you are using?
Yeah, good question, but not just on the sensitivity of the test, but on a couple of other animal factors. And the fact that the feedlot cattle, which have got, you know, probably the best nutrition with exactly the right amount of protein, carbohydrates, and the right amount, you know, the right palatability, even they have an impact at 25 eggs per gram. So that probably gives us a clue that animals are suffering from effects on their average daily gain at even, you know, 25 to 50 eggs per gram. Now, again, it's going to have a different effect if it's 25 eggs per gram of Osteotargia compared to 25 eggs per gram of Haemonchus. So for Haemonchus, you'd probably say, you know, 50, 100, maybe 150, maybe not that important, but for, yeah, you'd definitely be looking at an impact at 50 eggs per gram. And that's, again, dependent on season, because at certain times of the year, and in Victoria, it's mainly into the second half of summer and through the autumn into early winter, up to 95% of the Osteotargia worms will be inhibited not laying eggs. So even if you're seeing small numbers of eggs, you can probably increase the amount of adult worms that are there.
Good. Thank you. The next question is from Darold Klindworth. Sorry if I pronounced that badly. Yeah, so a question about bubbly runny poo with a worm infection. Is the runny poo more bubbly?
Daryl, look, I wouldn't read too much into the worm infection, but bubbly poo is an indication of what's called hindgut fermentation, and that often happens with acidosis and poor digestion in the rumen. So that might be an indication that you need to turn down the grain a bit.
Yep. Next question is from Ian Marshman. Are there any post-modern, easier and fail-safe ways of using oral drenches?
There are, Ian. There is the gas-powered oral drench that you can get, where you have a fairly long hook. You don't even have to go too close to the animal. And the best place to see these is at a feedlot where an induction team is actually treating cattle. They often use oral drenches, and they will, of course, capture the animal in they don't call them a crush there, they call them a chute, usually a hydraulic chute, so that it's nicely secured, comfortable, and they'll gently put a hook into the animal's mouth, and they'll press a button, and the gas-powered dispenser will dispense a dose of oral drench. So they can be adapted to any farm really, and you can have very safe and easy ways of using an oral drench based on
that. Next question's from Claire Harris. Hey Claire, down in South Gippsland. Is the barber's pole worm found in cattle the same species as found in sheep?
Now, this is a really fascinating question, Claire. And the reason is because generally barber's pole worm in cattle, we think of them as Haemonchus placei, which is the cattle worm. The adults look exactly the same as the Haemonchus contortus we find in sheep, but the third stage larvae are different. So in our lab sometimes we'll culture up third stage larvae from cattle and have a look at the barber's pole worm and measure the length of their tail. And it's different between Haemonchus contortus and Haemonchus placei. Now, sometimes you do get sheep barber's pole in cattle, and it's a bit of a problem because the sheep barber's pole tend to be more resistant because they're exposed to more drenches and they have less refugia. And so if you do have sheep barber's pole worm in the cattle, then that can be they can be more difficult to kill.
Okay, another question from Ron Sawyer. Are there non-chemical strategies that are effective against worms, such as paddock rotation?
Yep. Rotation is an excellent way. Rotating with sheep is another good way of managing worm burdens, as is cropping, taking off hay and spelling paddocks. So they're all very valid strategies for decreasing the pasture larval contamination of it. And that actually is probably one of the critical parts of the worm game that we didn't talk about much today.
Good subject for another night. Question from Fiona McKenzie. What is the difference between McMaster method for counting and mini Flowtac? And why is the second method more sensitive?
Yeah, it all comes down to dilution factors. So generally with McMaster, you start off with maybe 2 grams of dung, and you'll dilute it in 50 ml of water or saline, and you'll count half a mil of that. So that's why you end up with a 50 extra gram sensitivity. With mini Flowtac, you start off with 5 grams of dung. You put 2 counting chambers that are each 1 mil, and so you 5 extra gram sensitivity. So you're simply using more dung, and you're looking at more volume of diluted dung. Now, that's not to say that you can't do that with McMaster. You can actually have a McMaster and just keep on counting chambers of McMaster to get it more and more sensitive, and you'll find that you can get down to that level. But the beauty of the mini Flowtac is that it actually rotates the sediment away from the eggs, and so the eggs are actually easy to see, so you can start off with a higher amount of dung in your sample.
Okay. All right, very good. That's all the questions. Oh no, we've got one more question. We might call this the last question, Kathy, and then we'll see if there's anyone on the phone lines who want to ask a question. And Kathy, maybe you could put up a slide, that slide that you had on at the beginning. You could just put that slide up. So the last question is from Katie Davis. How long does larvae last in the paddock and out of the host? Yeah, just approximate.
This is a really good question, Katie. The third stage larvae are the stage that live on the grass, and they have an interesting feature in that when they molt, they don't lose the skin from the second stage larvae. It sort of stays as a protective layer right over their entire body, and so they wriggle out of the dung pat and they go on the grass. With that sheath that they've got around them, that means they can't eat. So they wriggle around in the dirt, on the grass. Sometimes they go up the grass and they're waiting there. Now, if it's quite warm, they're cold-blooded creatures, so if it's warm, their metabolic rate goes up and they use up all their energy. Remember, they can't eat, so their energy reserves are limited. Cool, they'll just sit there and they'll just very slowly, and they won't use up their energy and they'll last a long time. And so over summer, you'll find that it may only take 6 weeks for those larvae numbers to go down 90%. Then over winter, it might take between 3 to 5 months for the larval numbers to go down 90%. So yes, it does depend on the species as well to some extent, because some worms are quite happy to live in the fecal pat until it rains, and then they'll move out. And brown stomach worm are a good example of that. Whereas Coperia tend to be a bit more direct. They'll try and get active straight away.
Okay. Okay, Kathy, since you've got the control, do you want to open up the phone lines and see if we've got anyone on the phone who would like to ask a question?
I'll do that right now, Darren. I'm just unmuting. It looks as though we've got 6 that have called in, but I've only got the ability to unmute 4 callers. I'm not sure where the other 2 callers have disappeared too, but so anyone that's called in on the phone, hopefully I've been able to unmute you now. So if you'd like to ask a question, just state your name and ask away. I think we've got one more question has come in from Ron in the Q&A box. I can read out. He's asking, is harrowing effective?
Yeah, and Ron, for a moment there, I thought you were a Harry Potter fan and you were talking about harrowing, which is, using magical creatures to decrease worm larvae on pasture. But I think you mean actually harrowing, which is dragging a harrow around behind the tractor and breaking up the dung pats and spreading out the dung. That definitely has a big impact on worms, because you're actually letting the worms dry out and they lose the protection of the dung pat, and they dry out more quickly, and that disperses them as well. If you look at a dung pat, you can see that there's an exponential decrease in the number of larvae around the dung pat, and that actually determines the eating behaviour of cattle. They're reluctant to eat very close to a dung pat. It's only when they're in high stocking rates and they're forced to eat close to the dung pats that they pick up the largest number of worms. So by harrowing, you're spreading the dung pats out, you're dispersing the worms, you're allowing them to dry out, and they're less likely to survive and infect the cattle.
Thank you, Matt. Now, we've got another question that's come in through the chat box, which is fine. Michael Close has asked, what is the best way of managing cattle and sheep together to minimise worms?
Oh gosh, there's been a few studies done on this, Michael, and the right answer really is a combination of cross grazing and spelling. And so grazing with your cattle to get the bulk of the grass down, and then sheep because they graze closer to the ground to get it closer to the ground, and then letting the pasture spell and grow up again. Now the actual best fit for your farm will depend on a lot of factors, including your grass species or the mixture of the pasture species that you have. And so I won't presume to be able to answer that in any sort of detail. I'll have to pass it on to one of your local experts.
Okay, thank you. I'll just call again to those that have phoned in if they've got a question they would like to ask verbally. So I'll put you back on mute. Okay. Well, I think we've pretty much covered. Ron, one last question from Ron, querying cross-grazing with horses. Is that effective?
There's only one worm, Ron, that is commonly picked up by horses from cattle, and that's a stomach hairworm, Trichostrongylus axii. And so that's probably one that you need to watch for. But apart from that, no, they don't share worms, and you can cross graze.
Great, thank you, Matt. All right, well, we've had a great range of questions there, so thank you to everyone for sending them through, and you've done a terrific job, Matt, of answering them all. I'd just like to take another couple of, not very long at all, couple of minutes of your time to ask you to complete a quick poll. Are you right to, yep, great. Darren's got that poll up there now. Hopefully everyone can see it. So there's 6 questions, won't take you very long at all. If you just want to start filling that in, that would be great. We'll just give you a couple of minutes to do that.
Thanks, everyone. If you've been on to my webinars before, you know how important this evaluation data is to not only our organisation, but to Meat and Livestock Australia, who provides some sponsorship towards these events. So really appreciate your feedback, and you know, we're able to put these events on for you without an entry cost. So but the evaluation is helps us to understand the impact that it has, and how to indeed provide better events in the future. So appreciate your feedback.
Thank you. We'll just give you a little bit longer.
And there's a question there that question number 6, where you can provide some input into webinars that we put on in the future. So if you've got a topic or an issue you'd like to hear more about, then by all means complete that, put that response into question 6, and we can look into that for you.
Okay, I've lost the ability to see that, how that polling's going now, Darren. So if you want to just close that when you think it's everyone's done, and we can wrap up.
All right. So you want me to close that off now?
Yep. If you think that's.
I think there's still a few people using it.
Okay, we'll
So
leave it open. That's
just leave it open,
it
and
can stay open. That's fine. That's fine. I'll just I'll just wrap up because it's getting late and people will be wanting to get to bed. So thank you everyone for. Sorry, this thing's on a timer, and I. Thank you all for joining tonight's webinar. We've had a great response. We've had close to 200 registrations. Not all of those joined on the night, which is what tends to happen. A lot of people register to get the recording later, but we've had nearly half of the registrations join, which is great. So I think we had 93 on tonight, which is a terrific result. I hope you've all enjoyed the presentation. I'm sure you found it very valuable and useful. A lot of information there to take away. I'd like to once again thank Matt very much for being part of this webinar and giving us some great insights into worm control. There will be at least one more webinar in this series. The next one will take place in July and it will be delivered by Dr. Shane Thompson from the Albury Vet Clinic. And the topic of that will be the value of breeding objectives. Everyone in on this evening's webinar will be notified of that event once we confirm all the details. We're just sort of finalising that with Shane. So thank you again for participating and for completing the survey poll. We'll keep that open a bit longer if you're still working on that. But to all of you, enjoy the rest of your evening. Thanks again and good night.